and then we'll hand over to Rob. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Animal Think Tank's narrative webinar for November. The title's Looking Back and Looking Forward, Learning from Our Narrative Legacy. So at Animal Think Tank, we wear a lot of different hats in our work day to day, and our host today is no exception. His usual role is in public research and testing, but today he's putting on a history teacher hat, as well as giving us a glimpse into a possible narrative future. His name's Dr. Robert Udele, and I'll pass you over to him right now.
Cool, thanks very much, Beth. So hi, my name's Dr. Robert Udele, and usually I'm the quantitative research and testing lead on Animal Think Tank's narrative research project. So kind of just going to start with like, what is a narrative? So this can be stories, myths, ideas, or beliefs, which can propagate throughout a culture, and they can change over time, as we'll see in today's talk. And these narratives can influence the way that we interpret the world, so that it can provide a lens through which we interpret events. And it can shape how we behave by kind of dictating social norms. And so with that in mind, the Narrative Research Project is about finding the most effective cultural narratives that will help to persuade the UK public to support the animal freedom movement. And sometimes it's a good idea to kind of sit back and take stock and look at kind of where we've come from and what we've achieved in the past. Think about like what lessons we've learned and use that knowledge to improve our advocacy in the future. So to give like an overview of what I'll be talking about. So first, looking back, I'm going to be giving a potted history of animal narratives and the social and cultural events that have helped shape those narratives, as well as, and then I'll be doing an analysis of today's dominant narrative, which is the Go Vegan narrative. Then we'll be looking forward, and we'll be talking about potential new narratives that we could use in addition to those existing ones that will bolster our advocacy, and thinking about what lessons can we learn from the past. So to give you an example of a cultural narrative, the American dream, this is the idea that anyone can come to America and through their own self-reliance and hard work and discipline, they can make a good life for themselves. And this values things like individualism and equal opportunity. And this narrative has pervaded throughout their culture. So, for example, it influences the products they buy, or the types of houses they buy. Like here's a picture of the American dream with the white picket fence at the front. And it even influences who they see as heroes, like the kind of rugged, individualistic action man. And narratives also influence our attitudes towards animals, amongst all sorts of things. So the first example I'm giving here is the kind of meat is manly myth. And this is a narrative that eating meat is a signal of like strength and power, and it kind of ties into that like hunter-gatherer myth that once upon a time it was the man's role to kind of go out and provide the protein and support and protect the tribe, basically. Another very widely held myth or narrative is the meat is necessary myth, and this is a narrative that's pushed quite heavily by the animal agriculture industry, and that is that meat is kind of necessary for our own survival and thriving, and it has all the necessary protein and micronutrients and so on that we need. But these narratives also don't need to be about the food that people eat. It can also be about our place in the world and our relationship with other animals. So one very long-standing and deeply ingrained narrative is that of human exceptionalism. So this is the idea that there's kind of like a natural hierarchy in terms of natural moral hierarchy, with humans at the top. And maybe humans are in fact separate and distinct from other animals. Like a lot of people don't even consider themselves as animals. So this is our theory of narrative change. Like when we're doing advocacy, we are planting seeds in people's minds. But the challenge is at the moment, there's kind of like an infertile cultural landscape. So at the moment, the narratives aren't there to support those seeds to germinate and grow. So the aim is to find new narratives that can be effective and overshadow the existing harmful dominant narratives. And ultimately, we hope we can change the cultural landscape so that all these seeds can bloom and blossom and grow vigorously. And there is kind of a reason we choose this approach, and that is partly it's shown success in previous social movements. So, for example, the marriage equality movement in the US, for a long time, activists were talking about the right to marry, and this just didn't really sit right with people. I don't think people understood really what it meant. And then the Freedom to Marry campaign, they did lots and lots of research about people's values and their identity. And they found that if they appealed to their values of freedom and love, so we should have our freedom to marry the people we love, this resonated with people across the political spectrum. So this narrative, alongside lots of hard work, helped them win marriage equality very rapidly in the US. So I'll give my kind of potted history of these narratives, starting in the 19th century. And at that time, the kind of dominant existing view was that animals are sort of like automata or like robots. So they're kind of these input response machines. So this image of like a robot duck actually was from the 18th century. And they obviously didn't think that animals were full of cogs and wires, but it kind of reflects the sort of thinking of like these input response machines, which effectively had no feeling and no sentience. Another view of animals at the time was that an animal's value was entirely derived from their utility, so how useful they are to humans and what they can produce for us. And at the time, the science of selective breeding was taking off. So in the 1800s, there was this sort of period of time where people were commissioning these paintings of rectangular cows. And it was basically breeders kind of wanted to show off their prize breed. And so they commissioned paintings to show how big and well-bred they were, these huge bulking bodies on like spindly legs. But also during that time, there was a growing awareness that animals do in fact feel pain and experience things. And therefore, because of that, their welfare should be considered. And some of the events that shaped that were, for example, there were scientific advancements. So we were gaining a better understanding of how humans process pain, as well as physiology. And so we kind of recognize like, well, they must be feeling pain. They've got a similar kind of nervous system to us. And then also Richard Martin, who was a member of parliament at the time, he helped pass the first piece of animal welfare legislation, which was the Cruel Treatment of Animals Act in 1822. He then went on to establish the RSPCA, which is the Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And they're a huge animal welfare charity in the UK who will be, actually their bicentennial is this year. Additionally, like during the 19th century, there was this rise of naturalism and interest in understanding the natural world. So people were understanding like how nature worked, and it led to this like reverence of nature. And then also like Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species that explained how species evolved through natural selection. And this kind of took humans out of this special place and put us in the family tree with the rest of the animal kingdom. And in fact, you know, Darwin became atheist after kind of developing his theory. So most of the 19th century, the dominant pro-animal narrative was one of welfareism. There was very little in terms of real fundamental animal rights or abolition, but there were a couple of examples. The first being in the 1870s, there was an anti-vivisection movement, and also possibly the first animal rights sort of treatise written by Henry Salt in 1894. And he argued that animals should be regarded as sentient beings, and that because of this, they're deserving of moral consideration. And although the term speciesism wouldn't be coined for another 76 years, he basically argued against speciesism. But I think these sort of animal rights abolitionist views were kind of a bit of ahead of their time at this point in time. So moving on to the 20th century, for the first kind of half of the 20th century, there didn't really seem to be much progress made in terms of animal freedom. There was kind of incremental welfare reforms, but not much else. And then in the 1950s, the BBC started showing nature documentaries with, for example, David Attenborough, where he would kind of explore nature and we'd get to learn about wildlife. And this again increased this narrative of reverence for nature, as well as an increase in valuing conservation, which is a good thing, of course. One slight challenge of this narrative, though, is that it puts the emphasis on conserving the species. You know, as long as the species is conserved or the populations are conserved, people see that as a good thing, regardless of how the individuals within that population are treated. Then in the 1960s, Ruth Harrison published the book Animal Machines. And this was when factory farming was really starting to take off. And she actually coined the term factory farming. And so in her book, she kind of exposed like the cruelty and the really terrible treatment that the animals were going through on these farms. And in terms of narrative, this was really important because it kind of exposed the industry's narrative. The animals are just kind of these like objects or commodities that function like machines, sort of like continuing on from that automata narrative that I mentioned earlier. And unfortunately, this narrative still seems to persist amongst the industry. So, for example, it might have been last year, I think, Earthling Ed had a TV debate with a sheep farmer who said sheep are almost the ultimate renewable technology. Then in the 1970s, Peter Singer published Animal Liberation. And by this time, the term speciesism had been coined. So he basically, his thesis was to argue against speciesism. And that his point was basically, you know, the capacity for suffering and enjoyment should be the only criteria for moral consideration, regardless of any other criteria like species or intelligence and so on. And therefore, the interests of all animals should be weighed equally. Then into the 1970s and 80s, we saw the rise of direct action. So, for example, the Animal Liberation Front would break into facilities and rescue animals. And the Hunt Saboteurs Association would disrupt fox hunting. And so the narrative here is, you know, this is an urgent moral issue that cannot wait, right? There's animals in need now who need to be helped. And unfortunately, the traditional routes of things like gaining popular support or passing legislation are just too slow and ineffective. Unfortunately, this kind of approach possibly had some unintended consequences. So, particularly with the types of clothing worn by the Animal Liberation Front, it created this perception of like radical extremists and militant animal advocates. And that kind of militant vegan trope continues to this day. So if you search for articles about militant vegans, you'll get pictures of people simply holding signs So it's very easy to be labeled militant these days. And then into the 1990s and the 2000s, there was growing awareness of how our consumption patterns and the products we buy have effects around the globe on the environment, on animal welfare, on humans. And so there began to grow this consumer power narrative. That is, we can influence the world by voting with our wallet. We can buy the high welfare eggs, or the fair trade sugar, for example. And during this time, we saw the rise of things like the Fair Trade logo or the RSPCA Assured logo, or Rainforest Alliance, which would be on products telling consumers that these are better products. And actually, yeah, I remember when I was at university in 2006, I was part of the Fair Trade Society. And I also remember at the time, like, caged eggs from caged hens were like the main thing being sold in shops. And there seemed to be this shift where people became aware that that was not a good thing. And I remember buying the sort of free range eggs thinking, oh, isn't this so much better? Of course, you know, I know better than that now, I like to think. So now into this century. So at the start of the 2000s, there was kind of a rise, a second generation of popularity of these nature documentaries, with David Attenborough still narrating them 50 years later. And this again helped raise consciousness about environmentalism and conservationism, which, you know, again, is great for wild animals and helping conservationism. But like I mentioned earlier, it puts the focus on populations. So I've heard people say things like, oh, well, if we got rid of farming, you know, all these, you know, cows would go extinct or something like that. So people are thinking like of the population or the species rather than the individuals who are actually suffering in these systems. And of course, these shows would focus on the wild animals, and those exploited on farms or in laboratories would be left behind. Over the last 20 years, there's also been an increase in intersectionality. So that is the relationship between the animal freedom movement and other social justice issues. So that could be like health, environment, feminism, workers' rights, and so on. But just to give two examples, I don't know if anyone remembers, a couple of years ago, there was this big pandemic, and we all had to stay indoors. And at the time, there was an increased awareness of zoonotic diseases, and people became aware of practices that we humans are doing to other animals, not just these wet markets in China, but also factory farming, and how these are breeding grounds for new diseases that are going to harm animals as well as ourselves. There's also been this stream of relating the animal freedom to the climate crisis. So, for example, Animal Rebellion pushed for changing the food system to one of a plant-based food system, which would help to cut our emissions and draw down carbon. Additionally, in the last few years, with the rise of social media, we've probably all seen online like posts and videos of these cute animals, which has certainly helped foster greater connection and kinship with other animals and increased our love for what people would call pet animals, which is great. But also, again, might be a kind of a double-edged sword to this. For example, it may have increased sort of infantilization of these animals. Often you hear them referred to as like fur babies or doggos or something like that. And of course, like the other narrative I mentioned, exploited animals on farms that aren't perceived as cute, or even, you know, animals that would be considered pests or not cute animals, also kind of largely left out again. So there seems to be speciesism at play, basically. Like some species are worthy of our attention while others are not. So next, I'd like to talk about today's dominant narrative. And I would argue that that dominant narrative is the go vegan narrative. So this has kind of evolved out of the ethical consumer narrative that I talked about earlier. And that is that changing the world relies on individual level change. So by voting with our wallets, we can boycott the bad industries and support the good ones. And it seems to have been, taken off in the last few years. We've all, at least in the UK, we've all seen a boom in popularity of vegan alternative proteins. And this is a graph of sign-ups to Veganuary, which is a charity that encourages people to try a vegan diet for the year of January. And every year they've had more and more sign-ups. And even though this is only up till 2021, I think this year it's continued rising. They've had 700,000 sign-ups this year. There are a few kind of problems though. So firstly, it doesn't seem like the actual number of vegans is increasing. Our research, when we've conducted surveys, we find about 2% of the population are vegan, and that is kind of the same number as it was like 10 years ago. Other studies are also finding this, not just in the UK, but also in the US. And they're finding that flexitarian or vegetarian diets are the things that are increasing. So like I said, there's a few problems like with this narrative, or challenges, I like to think. First is that in our research, we found that most people associate veganism with a kind of personal lifestyle or dietary choice. Like it's just a choice that affects you and no one else. So it's just, just as morally relevant as like going on a paleo or a keto diet. And because of this, it's not associated with the urgent social justice issue that it is. And so I've heard people say things like, I respect you not eating meat, that's your choice, but you should also respect what I eat as well. I've also heard people say things like, well, if they don't want to eat meat, why do they eat things that taste like meat? And, if you think of it as just a dietary choice, that kind of makes sense. There's also a psychological barrier. So there's a social cost to becoming vegan. That is, if you become vegan, you now have to join this radical militant outgroup who are pretty vilified by society at large. There's also a perception of even if you accept those things, a perception of having to give up too much. I think a lot of us have heard from others, non-vegans, that a vegan diet is basically eating rabbit food. And so it puts the focus on what that individual is going to be losing out. And it takes attention away potentially of the animals and the plight and the benefit that they will gain from it. And so because of these things, and also because we as humans want to maintain what's called a positive self-image, that is, we want to see ourselves as good generally. But if someone comes up to you and says, well, you eat meat and that's bad, that attacks your positive self-image. And as a general rule, people would rather do things to protect that self-image. So there's many documented coping or strategies or defense strategies that people utilize. So, for example, the 4 N's, which is meat is necessary, natural, normal, and nice. Another very difficult one to overcome is futility. So like, okay, well, let's say, I can eat a vegan diet. It's kind of futile anyway, because even if I change, 7 billion other people aren't going to. So what's the point? And then there's things like price and convenience that are kind of common misconceptions about vegan diets. Another final drawback is that it prevents like big picture thinking. So of course, individual consumer habits are part of this bigger system. It's one of the cogs in the machine. But by focusing on that, it kind of prevents this systemic thinking. So with that in mind, I'm not saying we should stop advocating for people to eat to be vegan. They absolutely should. But what are the new narratives that we can use in addition to that narrative that potentially could maybe get around some of these cognitive defense strategies? So the first one that I'd like to talk about is a systemic narrative. So that is that, you know, we are people of our time. There's this system that's held up by cultural norms, history, as well as corporate and political incentives that maintain that system. And if we say it's the system at large that we're part of, that's not attacking them as an individual. And hopefully this will kind of get around those defense strategies. One example of using this quite successfully in the UK, Animal Rising have a plant-based universities campaign where they're getting students to vote for their students in student unions to vote for the cafes and cafeterias on their campus to offer plant-based food. And they're having a bit of success at this throughout the country. And, you know, this is a systemic change. And now anyone who walks into that cafe will automatically be changing their consumption habits and changing the demand for meat or plant-based food. Another narrative that research has been shown to be effective is the voter or citizen frame. So, you know, like in this example picture here, you can see yourself as a consumer, but you can also see yourself as a citizen who's an active participant in the democratic process. And in this narrative, we're saying you can use your political power in addition to, of course, the purchases you make to vote, sign petitions, call your member of parliament, and so on. And one reason this might be an effective narrative is because voting or signing a petition is a much smaller change than this like complete identity shift. And it opens up the possibility for further transformation. So what a lot of psychological research has found is that our values are actually informed by the behaviors we engage in rather than the other way around. Like the intuition is we have our values and then we pick behaviors consistent with those. But what people actually tend to do is kind of go, right, what's my behavior? Oh, I seem to be in support of banning factory farming. So actually that's bad. But another aspect to this narrative, or a narrative that might kind of work in conjunction with it, is the social progress narrative. So this is a narrative that there's this societal struggle. It's not just an individual one that's up to you to make changes, and that society is inevitably progressing, which I think we can see from like our little potted history earlier, like we are moving in the right direction. I think the benefit of this narrative is it avoids that sense of futility. Like we are going to get there. We're on the path to getting there. And our research, as well as research by others, has found that this actually increases support for animal rights and animal freedom. And so the idea is that by voting, you can be part of this bigger solution. And I'd like to give an example of this narrative in use. So PETA have released their Christmas ad for this year. And the ad includes a turkey singing about all the weird traditions that we have at Christmas, like putting trees indoors, lighting Christmas puddings on fire, or kissing beneath the mistletoe. And like, they're all a bit weird, aren't they, if you actually think about it? And one tradition in particular is eating turkey at Christmas. Essentially, they're saying like, you know what, we can still keep all the fun stuff about Christmas, those silly traditions. We just give up this one little one that's harmful. So I'd like to kind of finish on like, what lessons can we learn? Lesson one. So this is kind of what lessons can we learn for kind of narrative strategy, what narratives can advocacy groups use to better improve their advocacy. So I think the first one is to think about like, how does our strategy affect public perception? So if you saw this picture and you'd never heard of the Animal Liberation Front, you might actually think these guys are like holding these dogs hostage rather than trying to save them. So wearing masks and looking militant, that I'm sure they had good reasons and rationale for it at the time, but it might have had a backfire effect on public perception. And I'd like to give an example of doing this effectively. So Direct Action Everywhere have had this strategy of open rescue, where they've gone into farms and rescued sick and injured animals without the masks. They're just showing themselves like, we are just regular people. We care about animals just like everyone else. This is a moral issue. Like if you heard a neighbour's companion animal being abused next door, you'd intervene. And this is, as a result, it's getting it into the courts and into the court of public opinion. And I don't know when, but sometime today, I believe he's having his sentencing being decided some point today as well. So lesson 2 is I think we need to find narratives that don't activate these defense strategies that I talked about. We need to find narratives that avoid attacking people's positive self-image. Like, can they still get involved without feeling like they are the problem or they should be guilty? And I think we can achieve this by focusing on systemic change, such as like asking people to be in the voter frame instead of the consumer frame. And like the example I gave earlier, Animal Rising's plant-based universities campaign is a really good example of that. Lesson 3 is to think about the weaknesses of our narrative. So I know the documentaries weren't necessarily promoted by animal advocates or activists, but they have helped promote conservation. And like I said, kind of one sort of unintended consequence is that they created the perception that the level we should care about is the level of species or population, and it's neglected the plights of individual animals. Another example is kind of like this rise in cute pet pictures on social media. Obviously, this has helped our kinship, or perception of kinship with dogs and cats, but it's neglected our relationship with other animals like pigs and sheep and cows and chickens. And it's kind of created this, it's enforced that it's kind of strengthened the different categories that we have in our minds about different animals. So I think we need to find narratives, and people are already doing this, of course, that focus on individuals rather than the group, and focus on the amazing inner lives of these animals, that they are compassionate, intelligent, feeling, they enjoy life, they want to live, and they don't want to suffer. And yeah, I think that brings me to the end. So I welcome any questions. And Beth's muted. Okay, where's Nasla? Hang on, if I do it. There you go.
Hooray!
Hey, we can hear you now.
Yes, I'd been my host status was cruelly usurped. Okay, thank you very much for that, Rob. We do have just under 20 minutes, no, just over 20 minutes actually for a Q&A. So anybody who'd like to hang around and ask some questions, please feel free to put them in the chat now. I think what is always really interesting for me is the Go Vegan narrative is, I always feel like it sounds like we're decrying it when we're not really. It's definitely a good narrative for sort of individual change, but it's this systemic change that needs to be part of that, needs to be part of our strategy as well. And again, change it from this consumer view to a more citizen kind of view. So while we wait, if there's any more comments in the chat, I'll bring your attention, Rob, to some of the things we've been we've been talking about in the chat while you've been talking. So Serenity, before she left, she was saying, this is interesting. I wonder if talking about animal freedom would be more effective than talking about animal rights. And then Harriet added to that, you can create lovely positive stories about an animal's freedom to live its life. Rob, do you have any comments?
Yeah, so I think that aligns with our thinking very much that um, everyone, like, I think freedom is easier to get. Like, we all want freedom, whereas rights are very kind of abstract and esoteric. So yeah, I think we should be talking about animal freedom, maybe emphasizing that more than animal rights. But of course, we not to say that these are different things. Like, you can still have the freedom from cruelty instead of the right to be protected from cruelty. So far, we've done a bit of research on it, and we did some message testing where we would ask different groups to read different messages, kind of advocating for either animal freedom or animal rights. And in terms of how those messages affect their values towards those things, there wasn't actually any difference. It could be, in 10 years' time, if we use that narrative, the freedom narrative, that will change. And we also did some analysis on kind of their understanding of that. And there does seem to be a much more kind of concrete understanding of what freedom looks like. Like, people can actually imagine that in their head, whereas rights is a bit harder to kind of grapple with.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, rights is much more it's a much more legal frame as opposed to an emotional one, isn't it? We have had a few questions come through in the chat, but before we do, one thing I just wanted to uplift. You mentioned the 1822 cruel act against the cruel and improper treatment of cattle, and Alex mentioned in the chat that they've just produced a 6-part audio drama podcast for the 200th anniversary of the
Cool.
act. Yeah. So there's about 30 interviews included with Carol Adams and Richard Ryder that's been mentioned, and there was a link in the chat that Alex added, but I will just paste it again. And Melda is highly recommending Alex's podcast too. So recommendations there, everybody.
Excellent. Maybe we can share it later as well. You put it in the chat as well.
Yeah, I put it in the chat. I think it's something to definitely, I know I'll be listening. Okay, a couple of questions in the chat. From Harriet. Maybe focusing on populations of domestic animals might be interesting. For example, the number of animals who are incarcerated in factory farms in Europe as we speak. I think individual stories linked to the big picture could be very powerful.
That's a great point. Yeah, I agree. And it's something we need to do more testing on in the future. I have a feeling sometimes I've seen people kind of trying to advocate by saying, like, look how many animals are slaughtered every minute or something like that. I have a feeling that probably creates this sense of futility that I was talking about. Like, oh, it's such a big problem. What can we do? And that might even be a challenge that we face with the systemic narrative approach. It's going to have its own challenges as well.
Yeah,
it's
difficult, isn't it? Because facts always hit less hard than feelings. I think it's Ben Shapiro who says facts don't care about your feelings, but the reality is that our feelings don't care about facts. So I do like this idea of like individual stories linked to the big picture. And I think we've got a real opportunity around Wayne's sentencing with Queen. Actually, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her name, but I think it's Queen, the female chicken that he rescued, because she exemplifies that individual story that really speaks. So I'd love to know more about her.
It could have been anyone else.
Yeah. It could have been anyone else. It would be really good to know more about her. Like, what does she enjoy? Who is she? And I think that's the kind of narrative that we could really use like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. A question from Courtney. I'd like to talk a bit more about how we can coordinate message frames across the movement, especially given how effective our opposition has been in this vein, at least in the US. And that's, yeah, I think we'd like to
We
definitely like to coordinate.
Yeah, definitely need to. I mean, in terms of what we're working on, we are working on, like, we want sort of narrative unity, basically. I think that will be really powerful. So it's something we've got our eye on. We've released a messaging guide in January. I've forgotten, a few months ago.
March.
No, it was in
No,
March.
it was later than that. It was
It was
August.
really recently. It was. I don't even know what month we're in anymore. But hey, check out our website. We've got a messaging guide, and we'll be releasing like the next version early next year as well. And it'll be based on like all the research that we're doing and like the narratives that we're finding to be more effective. So hopefully, yeah, I totally agree. We need to all be on board and finding narratives that are the most effective.
Okay. Sorry, I've got lost in the chat scrolling. So Abby says, wondering if you can say more about the research behind how taking a small action opens up the possibility of an individual making larger changes. What sort of next step actions are people most likely to take after a small voting type action?
So this is, yeah, I have no specific studies are coming to mind. This is just kind of like my general knowledge of psychology. So there's this idea of there's like different persuasion tactics. So like one of them is called this is the foot in the door technique, where you kind of get them to agree to something small, and once you've done that, getting something slightly larger becomes much easier. So maybe signing a petition on Facebook or whatever is like very easy to do, but then next thing you find yourself joining a Facebook group, and then you end up attending a meeting. I don't know. These are just made up examples. But yeah, like I was saying, like a lot of psychology shows that our behaviors are kind of mostly influenced by habits and our environment. And then we then interpret our values based on the way we're behaving. So getting that foot in the door kind of might be a good approach. I don't know. I hope I've answered your question there.
Certainly given us a lot. Certainly given us something to think about. Yeah. Okay. I think we had a question from Melda, who's going to be unmuted.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm too tired to type out this question. I'm ill in bed with COVID.
Oh.
But thank you so much for your presentation. I'm doing my PhD research on animal rising and their strategies, and I was doing a literature review on the animal rights movement's history. So this has given me a lot of good material. I'll definitely be watching the recording. My question is, and I'm curious about what ATT thinks about this, because obviously I'm an abolitionist vegan. And this is the thing that I struggle with the most, because you've mentioned in your presentation that vegan numbers keep staying the same. However, vegetarians and flexitarians, these numbers are increasing. So as animal freedom fighters, and abolitionists, do we champion vegetarianism and flexitarianism as a stepping stone? You know, it's a pragmatic strategy, but you know, it breaks my heart to say someone, oh yeah, you know, try vegetarian first, and then, you know, so I also find that some people are obviously more open to more subtle forms of, you know, vegetarian, you know, flexitarian foods. And I'm living with a flexitarian at the moment, so I also find that me being less radical has more impact on them. And this has been my personal advocacy as well in Turkey.
Yeah.
You know,
can I just interrupt you there? Sorry, Beth's got a point, I think.
Well, I was happy to let Melda finish.
Okay, sorry.
Do you have anything else to say?
I'm rumbling on, but yeah, as an abolitionist, like morally, this is my biggest moral conflict.
It's a big challenge. I felt that as well. I totally get where you're coming from. I feel like, I mean, so for my journey, I tried going vegan with my girlfriend at the time, now wife, 8 years before I went vegan. And then it was several years of like pondering it, being a flexitarian, then a vegetarian, and then eventually vegan. Um, I think we have, like, it is difficult. I think ultimately we have to say, like, this is what we stand for. You know, we're not going to kind of give up on our values. Um, but we have to acknowledge, like, the psychology of it is that for most people, going from full meat eater to vegan, it's perceived as too much of a big step.
Yeah.
So I think if we do it in the right way, where we acknowledge, like, look, we've been indoctrinated from a very young age that this is the way to do things, and there's a lot of like cultural baggage that we sort of need to shake off to get there, and I think that's okay. And yeah, it's pragmatic, probably going to get people there sooner. But also, this is talking about like diet change. So, you know, like I was saying, like if we get people thinking in the citizen frame, we're more like, you know, they can get engaged. And research has shown that a lot of standard practices, the vast majority of people are against. So there's lots of things we can get people on board with without them necessarily being vegan. And then hopefully that leads to personal growth down the line. Sorry, Beth.
Well, I was going to say, if I can make a point, I don't think I think that lowering the barrier to entry is really helpful. I think that not having to be vegan, like so when I joined Animal Think Tank, I wasn't vegan, and the barrier to entry was low. It allowed me to get involved from the place of care that I understood at that time, because ATT connected with me on a shared value of compassion. And I, you know, even when I was eating meat, I was a compassionate person. I just was stuck in that frame. So if you connect with people on that value of compassion, you can get them to act without they can advocate for systemic change without necessarily making that individual change. And with systemic change comes more individual change. But obviously with more individual change comes more systemic change. It's not like they're not connected.
It's not either or.
No.
Yeah. Well, that's great you've shared that, Beth. And thanks for your answer, Rob.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear more about your thesis and what you found as well, because I'm learning about all this stuff as well.
Yeah, I've just started. So I will be sharing once I collect more data, and I've
Excellent. That would be great.
Okay. Thank you, Mulder. I have another, and I must apologise if I butcher the pronunciation of your name, but Kasia, I think maybe how it's pronounced. So she has two questions. So the first one's more of a comment. I'm wondering who would be described as the carriers of narratives mentioned in the 19th century before mass media, etc. Because of illiteracy, there's not much written evidence. However, I'm aware of some preserved materials in Poland that shows the peasantry was very aware that animals feel pain. It's interesting how, with a narrative shaped, were there any not dominant narratives? Not quite sure what that means just at the end there. Or was it, yeah, I guess, were there any dominant narratives, or were there like lots of little communities of narratives? I guess is what she means there.
Yeah, probably. This is kind of hitting the limits of my knowledge, to be honest. But you know, when we talk, so like at the start, when I was talking about like 19th century narratives, like on the one hand you had the kind of perception of them being like robots, and on the other, like they actually do feel pain and are sentient. There's probably like both at the same time, like they still are now. Like some people believe in sentience, other people don't. And I don't really know much more than that. I know, like I mentioned the intersectionality movement. Sorry, not intersectionality. What's the word? Anti-vivisection movement of the 1870s. I mentioned intersectionality because that was led by first wave feminists. So I think one of the leaders of that went on to be involved or set up the suffragettes. I don't know. So it was these kind of like it was the same people involved in like the suffragettes that were involved in that movement at the time. The kind of working class, I guess, were probably too busy to do much else. Yeah, sorry if I can't answer any better than that.
Well, we've already had some excellent help from Chetan
Oh,
and
great.
Alex. So Chetan suggests the Roger Yates YouTube channel, and Alex suggests the work of Erica Fudge as a historian explores longer history of where people got their views of animals from, and
Brilliant.
suggests also Hilda Keen's books for more 19th and 20th century history. Thank you
Oh,
very
cool.
much.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
More things to go and explore.
Kasia had a second question. Are you aware of any significant differences between the current farmed animal related narratives? The current farmed animal related narratives in the UK and other European countries?
Let me think. I'm not off the top of my head. There probably are differences. Like, for example, in Britain, veal, I think, is pretty much non-existent. That was kind of vilified, I think, in the 90s and then boycotted quite heavily. Whereas in Spain, maybe, I think Mediterranean countries, it's still quite popular. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, I'm more familiar with like the British kind of narratives, to be honest. That's just the context that I'm working in. Have to kind of stay somewhat focused, unfortunately.
Yeah,
there's definitely.
go on. Sorry, Rob.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's definitely a strong like great British meat narrative that you see in advertising a lot. I think like as a play on words because the word great is there and it has two meanings. Like it's great food, like good quality, as well as it being from Britain and it being related to like your local kind of small farmer. And yeah, that probably exists elsewhere as well.
Yeah, I wonder if the pastoral idyll idea is. I imagine that's quite more influential in
Mm.
Britain than elsewhere. We have this idea of a farmer that's very sort of steeped in British culture that I
Yeah.
think probably wouldn't be as prevalent or as influential elsewhere.
Mm.
Okay. Last question from Chetan. Do you feel the animal movement has slowed down since COVID-19?
I can only speak for, I mean, the UK, I think. And also just to caveat, I went vegan 2 years ago, so it's all quite new to me actually. Um, what I've noticed from my research is it's not a linear progression. So there'll be little spurts of progress and then it'll plateau. So like I mentioned, the first half of the last century, like was not really much progress was being made. And then 50s and 60s, there was like this sudden burst in movement. Animal Rising seems to be doing quite well. I don't know. We've got other people from ATT here who have been in the movement longer than I have that could probably chip in.
I do wonder if the discourse around zoonotic disease, what the impact of that's been. I wonder if that's potentially affected the way people relate to animals and the way people relate to animals and human health. I I'm not sure, to be honest, whether I imagine it's probably for the worse that it's had an effect because it's
Yeah, I did just see that a comment, something about this is in relation to sorry, this chat's disappeared for me.
the relation to the growth of vegans 2% in past 10 years.
So yeah, one slide that I removed, but I was going to include was so up until 2020, because I up until 2020, there was seemed to be this like exponential increase in veganism, and or it looked that way. Like if you look at Google Trends of searches for terms like vegan or veganism, veganuary, it sort of exponentially increases, peaks at the start of 2020, and since then it's kind of been declining then. And I do wonder if the pandemic put people into a kind of crisis mode, self-preservation mode, and that's going to make it difficult to think about like dietary changes and concern for others, especially those that are really outside your in-group. I imagine that had an impact. I don't know of any specific studies that have checked for that though. It wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. Okay, we're at time now. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to you as well, Rob. We've had a great time. We've had some great questions. And as Nazla's just put in the chat, please connect with us on LinkedIn, connect with us on Facebook, give us a shout whenever you want to chat or interested in any collaboration or anything like that. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.